Hey guys, it's Katie. Happy New Year's Eve! It's the last day of 2018, and that only means one thing. It's time for me to recap my year by talking about all of the books that I completed this year and all of the things that I did this year. And finally, I'm going to talk about my least favorite books and finish this video off and this year with a bang with my favorite books. So this is going to be a bit of a long one, so strap yourself in tight because we're in for a ride. So let's just launch right into all of the things that I managed to do in 2018. So for those of you who don't know, 2018 was one of the worst years I've had in a very long time. Not only was school incredibly stressful because of all of the classes and the tests and the things that I do, but I had one hell of a summer with my summer classes and professor drama, and it was just not a good time. My health was also questionable all year, plus I had some, family emergencies and things, and it was just, I don't know, it was just rough all around. But despite all of that roughness, I did manage to have a few good things scattered in. One, I was able to read quite a few books, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I also got to see some of my college friends in person for the first time since we graduated back in 2015, and that was just a great time. I miss them with all of my heart and soul when I'm not around them. Also, I managed to get into a few shows this year that I was not expecting. I watched Queer Eye back in June for Pride Month, and I watched Merlin in September, October, when I was having an incredibly rough time. And I just those two things and those few things were really great. I also got to do some other fun things this year. I was just overall just a pretty terrible year, but I did manage to find a few lights in that darkness. Now, launching into my bookish things, I managed to read 75 and a half books this year, and I will tell you why that there's a half in a minute, but basically I'm in the middle of a book right now, and it won't get done before 2019, so like last year, I've got another half a book to go, and that's the book that I will finish first in the year. 75 and a half books. That's really great for me because it even surpassed the goal that I had last year. Last year I managed to read, I think it was 70 books total, 70 and a half books, and the fact that I made it to 75 and a half is quite phenomenal, just, especially given the year that I had. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you every single book I read this year from the very beginning all the way to the very end. I'm not going to go into depth on them because I did reviews for pretty much every single thing, and so I'll just link my reviews playlist up above so you can see what my general thoughts on everything. Let's just jump right into everything I read. So the first book I read in 2018 was Dragon Haven by Robin Hobb, and then the next one was City of Dragons by Robin Hobb, and both I absolutely loved. If you don't know by now and have somehow been just living under a rock while being on my channel, you would know that I absolutely love everything by Robin Hobb, and there's a lot of Robin Hobb on this list, so just know I loved every single one of them. And you'll be golden. Then next I read Animal Farm, which was absolutely phenomenal. Loved it. And then I read, 4 Animorphs books, and I had mixed feelings on all of them. When I talk about Animorphs, because I read a ton of Animorphs, I started with book 26 from the Animorphs, and then I went all the way to the end to 54. And I had very mixed feelings across the board on all of those. So in January I read book 26, 27, 28, and 29 of that series, but I had mixed feelings about those 4. The next I read How Soccer Explains the World by Franklin Foer, and that was an okay book. It was not my favorite book by any means, but it wasn't my least favorite book either. It was just kind of in between. The next I read Fellowship of Fear by Aaron Elkins, and I really disliked that book. I really disliked that book. If you have been on my channel for very long, you know that I tend to not do rant reviews. This was one of 2 rant reviews that I did this year, the second being all the way at the end of the year. But I really disliked The Fellowship of Fear. The next I read Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff, and it was okay. I think I liked it a little bit more at the time I was reading it compared to reflecting back on it, but it was very, I don't want to say it was super informative, but it gave me a different insight into topics that I kind of knew a lot about from hearing it on the news or reading articles about it or talking about it with friends and family and classmates and things. But it was interesting in terms of giving me a new perspective on something that I already knew a lot about. And so I generally don't want to say I liked it, but it was interesting, and it's kind of a middle of the road book. Then next I read The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan, and I loved it. It was a great book, totally fun, and totally soothed my classics heart. The next was a book I read for school for a class that I was in at the time, and it was called The Anxious Lawyer, and I don't remember the author. I think it's Gina Cho and somebody else. And I actually enjoyed that a lot more than I was expecting to. It was really interesting, especially, since I am a baby law student. I really appreciated reading a book like that because it's putting things into perspective and giving me a bunch of realities that I just really feel like every lawyer should know, or law student even should know, because it was a really, really helpful book for putting a lot of things into perspective about lawyers and their mental health and certain ways that you can work on trying to overcome stressful things in that environment. Then next I read Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb, and I loved it. So what more is there to say? Then next I read 1984 by George Orwell, and I liked it, didn't love it, but I put it more towards the higher end of things rather than anything else. It was a really interesting book, and I'm finally understanding what a lot of people have been talking about after, in the news and in literature and books and things when they refer to, Big Brother and everything. So from that point of view, I really ended up enjoying 1984. I read Lights Out by Ted Koppel, and that was a terrifying book, but I enjoyed it. It was very informative, but it was also, frankly, very, very terrifying. I appreciate what the book was doing, and I enjoyed it for what it was. The next I read Elantris by Brandon Sanderson, and I loved that book, like, so much. It was such a great book, and I am so glad I read it. Then another book I read for the class that I was in was called Mindset, and it was really interesting. I like it more now upon reflection than I did when I was reading it. I found it to be incredibly repetitive and, frankly, just irritating at times, but looking back on it, it had quite a bit of value, and I really enjoyed it. And next I read The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and I adored that book. I adored that book. It was phenomenal. That's all I'm going to say for right now. The next I read Murder on the Appian Way by Stephen Saylor, and I really, really enjoyed that book. It was really interesting and really fun, and just a book that I really enjoy. The next was The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is basically Tolkien's translation of that Norse myth, that Norse song, and I really enjoyed it because Tolkien is my life. Then I read The Confidence Code by Katty Kay and Claire Shipman, and I really enjoyed that. It definitely taught me something and explained something that I already knew about in a different way. Then I read Inner Simplicity by Elaine St. James, and I had really mixed feelings about that book. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. It was just kind of meh, middle of the road. Some of the things in there were really interesting, but other things in there were just not for me. I read A Daybook of Positive Thinking by Patricia Wyant. I think that's how you say her name. And it was an interesting book. I mostly loved it for its artwork than anything else. It was a book of poems and inspirational quotes and sayings and things. And I read it during my May finals, and so it was just very inspiring, and it really helped me get through everything that was, during that stressful time. And then I launched back into an Animorphs book, and that was one that I remembered really loving. It might be one of my top favorites of the series. And then I reread The She, Heart of All Worlds by Charlotte Ashe, and I loved it. Despite having a very different experience with it this time, and maybe not enjoying it as much as I could have, especially because I was reading it with a more critical eye, it still has such an important and special place in my heart that I couldn't not love it, if that makes sense. And then I read Fool's Assassin by Robin Hobb, which I thoroughly enjoyed, despite it being one of the more jarring books of the series and the more emotionally heartbreaking, if you want to call it that. It was a different kind of book, but I definitely really enjoyed it anyway because it's a Robin Hobb book, and I can't not love me some Robin Hobb. And then I read a book for one of my summer classes, which is called Getting to Yes, and it's all about negotiation, and it was frankly not one of my favorite books, but I managed to learn stuff from it anyway, especially since I don't know a ton about negotiation. But I can say one thing: I learned more from that book than I did pretty much anything else that summer, so we'll call it a win, despite it not being my favorite thing. And then I reread The King and the Criminal, which is the second book in the Heart of All Worlds trilogy by Charlotte Ashe, just because the third book was supposed to come out this year, but then something ended up happening and the deadline ended up getting pushed back. So I think it might be coming out sometime in 2019, but I don't know that for a fact. But I thoroughly enjoyed The King and the Criminal, and I actually prefer it to the first book, which is interesting because I don't know if I felt that way upon first read. It might have been the other way around, or I might have liked them equally, but I definitely prefer The King and the Criminal this reread. And then I read Agatha Christie's A Murder on the Orient Express, which I adored. I think it might be my favorite Agatha Christie book to date. I've only read a handful of them, but I definitely think Murder on the Orient Express was my favorite from the lot. And then I jumped into Fool's Quest by Robin Hobb, and holy hell did I adore that book. It was completely and utterly incredibly phenomenal, and I will forever adore that book. And then I read a short story by Robin Hobb, which also takes place in the realm of the Elderlings, and it's called Her Father's Sword. I enjoyed it, despite it not going quite the way that I was expecting it to. And then I launched into Poland by James A. Michener, and I found it incredibly fascinating, incredibly heartbreaking, and incredibly overwhelming at times, but I ended up really enjoying it. And then I read Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb, which is the last book of the entire Realm of the Elderling series, so that was a very emotional read, but I definitely enjoyed it regardless. When I read Assassin's Fate, I took quite a bit of a break, and then I read Casino Royale by Ian Fleming, and I hated it. It was bad. Okay, glad we had that chat. But then I ended up reading Persuasion by Jane Austen, and I ended up really, really, really enjoying that. And then I read an Animorphs book, and I think this one was an interesting one. I remember kind of liking it, I believe. Then I read The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett, and unfortunately was not one of my favorite books this year. It was weird and unusual, but I enjoyed the comedic aspects of it and just everything that was in it, but not as much as I wanted to, if that makes sense. I'm still going to continue on reading Terry Pratchett though, just I don't think that one was my favorite. And then I launched into Fahrenheit 451, which I loved. It was so good, and just I loved it a lot. And then I read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I also loved a lot, and yeah, just that. And then I read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and I really, really enjoyed that. And then I read Good Omens. I needed a pick-me-up at that point, and loved it. It was so good. It was so funny. It was exactly what I needed at that point in my life. And then I read An Irish Country Doctor by Patrick Taylor, and oh man, did I love that book. It was such a pure, good, lovely book, and I'm just so glad I read it. And now we're getting into the Animorphs section, and this is where I read, I'm pretty sure, pretty much everything else. I read Animorphs books 31 through 35, and then I read Visser, which also takes place in Animorphs. It's one of the chronicles. And then I read books 36 through 39, I think it is. And then I read Megamorphs 4, and then I read 41 to 47, and then I read the Elemist Chronicles, which is the last chronicle, and then I read 48 through 54, which ended the series. So I basically launched my way through the rest of the Animorphs books, and I had a good time. I had mixed feelings about a lot of them. A lot of the middle books were kind of on the lower end, and then the last the last 5 in particular, I think it was, were spectacular, and I loved all of them. They were super good. And then after I finished Animorphs, I read the Grecian trilogy, and that was very disappointing. Very, very disappointing. And then I finished Leonardo da Vinci by Walter Isaacson, which I loved. And last, I finished The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, which I really, really enjoyed. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Currently, I am in the middle of The Girl in the Tower, which is the second book in the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. And I say it's probably too early for me to say whether I loved or really liked it, but I am enjoying what I've read so far. Thing you should know about the Winter Night trilogy, the first 2 books that I read, I haven't not gotten reviews out for those yet because I'm planning on doing a full trilogy review once the 3rd book comes out in mid-January. And then I'll give you my full thoughts on it once I've finished. So now that I've talked to you guys about all 75 and a half or whatever books that I read this year, I'll talk about some other things that I did this year that were related to bookish things. So I managed to participate in 2 readathons. One was quite successful and the other one was not so much. The first one I participated in was the Solvathon, which was done back in May, and I read 3 books for that out of the 5 prompts. I doubled up on a few, but I ended up doing Fool's Assassin, The She, and the Megamorphs 3. Those are my 3 books that I had planned for the readathon. I managed to complete 2 of them during the readathon, and then I ended up finishing Fool's Assassin after, and I just extended my vlogging adventures for that. But then in October, I participated in the Jackathon, and it was a major fail. I didn't get really anything done. I was going through a really tough time then. I was under a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and I just could not find the time to read properly. I ended up vlogging that too, but there just not a ton happens. But I did ultimately finish the books that I read for it, but just didn't end up really completing any of the challenges for the Jackathon. But then I also did a really, really cool project this year. After I finished the Realm of the Elderling series, I took an entire week in September. I wanted to do it a little bit earlier than I did, but I had some computer issues and I couldn't do it. But I ended up taking a whole week out of September, and I just put out ROTE content videos, and I'm going to link that playlist up above for you guys because I'm super proud of those videos that I put together, and I hope that they were really helpful for people. I've seen in a lot of the comments that a lot of people said it was helpful and that it was really interesting to hear, and it made them really excited to read them. So I'll be interested to talk to some of you guys as you are reading or as you're going through the series, if you choose to do so, because it's so important to me, and I love to talk to people as you go because you're gonna want to talk to someone, just trust me. But yeah, I'm really, really proud of those videos, and I hope that you guys ended up enjoying them as you watched them. But enough about that. Time to talk about my 10 least favorite books from the year. I tried to put them in an order, but my least favorite books honestly were pretty all over the place because I didn't include like Animorphs because it's too difficult to do. Like for Animorphs, I can't just pick individual books because it's just too difficult, and there were a lot of books that were 1 or 2 stars and they would have taken up the entire portion of my bottom. But know that like that was not included in either my top or my bottom books of the year because it's just too difficult to do. And a lot of my bottom books ended up being there are quite a few 3-star books in there, which, you know, doesn't mean that I didn't like them. There are, like, the bottom 3 that I'm going to talk about are definitely they earned their spots on this list, but the other 7 are just kind of in there to fill up space. So the way I'm going to do this is just go from my 10th and then go all the way down to my least favorite of the year. So coming in at number 10 is Getting to Yes. As I briefly mentioned before, it was all about negotiation, and it was just really dry, and I wasn't interested, and I wasn't into it. I had to read it for school. I mean, it was interesting, and I learned something from it, but at the same time, I didn't want to read it, and I didn't care. So I probably shouldn't have included it, but at the same time, it is a book that I read in its entirety, and I felt like it deserved its place. Number 9 is Mindset, because as I said before, it was not a book I necessarily enjoyed as I was reading it, but it's more of a book that I kind of have come to appreciate upon reflection. So it's mostly made its way on this list because I didn't love the way that the information was presented. It was incredibly repetitive and incredibly irritating after a while, just constantly talking about the same things over and over again, just in different ways, and I just stopped caring after a while, and I just got really annoyed with it. So, coming in at number 8 is Fire and Fury, which is by Michael Wolff, and my general thoughts on this are, while it was interesting and was giving me a new perspective into something that I already knew a lot about, it was really not giving me much new information. It was written in an okay way. I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it either. So this is another one that's kind of like in that middle wish-washy place. And at number 7 is How Soccer Explains the World by Franklin Foer. Another book. Didn't hate it, didn't love it. It was just kind of in between. It was talking all about the geopolitical world and just like different countries and different events and different groups from specific countries, and how soccer explains the creation of them. It's hard to even explain this book. We got it from a family friend, and I thought it looked kind of interesting, and then I read it. Then at number 6 is Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett. As I mentioned before, I just wasn't a fan of the characters. The plot was just weird, but I did enjoy the humor and the parody and the satire that was thrown in. It just made it more enjoyable, and I enjoyed certain aspects of it. So while it wasn't my favorite book that I read, there were definitely elements of it that I really enjoyed. Then at number 5 was Inner Simplicity by Elaine St. James, which I briefly mentioned earlier. It's kind of 100 like little things you can do in order to declutter your life, kind of a thing. And I don't mean like physically declutter, but it's just like decluttering your mind, decluttering your body, your soul, etc. There were definitely things in there that could be for really anybody. So I mean, there were aspects that I really liked, but then there were parts that just really didn't gel, and so it just was kind of a hit or miss kind of a situation for me. Despite this not really deserving this spot, I'm going to put it here because I need something for 10 to get to 10. But I'm going to talk about 1984 by George Orwell. I enjoyed it. I really did, and I really enjoyed getting to see it. I understood its literary value. I understood the story it was telling. It was really fascinating, and I enjoyed it. However, there were certain parts in it that just rubbed me the wrong way, and I don't really know quite what they were, if that makes sense. As I said, I enjoyed it, but it was not my favorite book. It shouldn't be on this list, but I don't have anything else that would fit. So we're going with that. And I'm not happy about it, but I'm sorry. So where these 3 are the ones that really deserve to be here. They're the reason this list exists. And we're going to start it off with the Grisha trilogy by Leigh Bardugo. Surprise, surprise. No one should be surprised that this trilogy is here. And I put it as the trilogy because to put in each individual book would just not be fair. So yeah, I'm putting the entire trilogy. So in essence, I will make 10. It's fine. But yeah, I'm really bitter because the thing about those books were pretty much garbage. The plot was predictable and boring. The world building was mediocre. The writing was meh. The characters were abominable. I hated all of them except for maybe like 2. And the world building was pulling on so much Russian history and culture and the language, and it just completely bastardized it, and it was just done in a very, very disrespectful way. You can see my full review thoughts thing in my reviews tab. But basically, it's just bad. I had a lot of issues with the trilogy, and you can see that in my review discussion. And that's really all I'm going to say about it for now, but I was thoroughly, thoroughly disappointed in those books and how they were written and how things were portrayed. The author claims that Ravka is not Russia, and yet everything that she took to create her world was Russian or Slavic based, like Eastern European based. She took certain aspects of the culture, certain parts of the language, and she just kind of did a few things here and there to make it her own. But really, she was just taking important core things to the culture and the history, the rich history of these people, and just took it as her own and created it into a fantasy. And honestly, that's just very disrespectful. But that's the tea. And then coming in at number 2 is The Fellowship of Fear by Aaron Elkins. And this book just absolutely disgusted me. It was, I had so many issues with this book. And I also have a review of that up above in my reviews playlist if you are interested. But, did I spill the tea and the salt on this one. Basically, it was misogynistic. The plot was scream-worthy. And just the main character was despicable. And there was really uncomfortable dialogue and really uncomfortable scenes just throughout the book. And I just honestly, I came this close to DNFing, but I can't DNF books. So that was really difficult, but I definitely threw my book across the room repeatedly because it was bad, and I was screaming the whole time. And then coming in at number 1, my least favorite book of 2018 was Casino Royale by Ian Fleming. I was really excited to read this book and this series going into it because, it's James Bond. It's the books series that inspired James Bond. And it was just so dull and flat, and the characters were just despicable. Once again, the plot was dumb. Like, nothing, I don't know, it was just like chopped up scenes that were just like pulled from here and there and just thrown together into a thing, and I just really didn't like it. I was really disappointed in it because I really liked James Bond the films, but I hated the book, and for so many reasons. Like, it was just written incredibly poorly. James Bond was a one-dimensional character who had no growth whatsoever. He was just dumb, and the world building just didn't exist because it's not that kind of novel. It took place in, where was it? It was some Caribbean island for this book, I believe. And the plot, it says the plot was just dumb. Like, I'm pretty sure I just zoned out the last half of the book because I just stopped caring. I mean, it's super short and whatever, so I mean, I got through it really quickly, but at the same time, like, it just felt, I don't know, it just felt like someone wrote a bunch of random scenes and just decided to throw them together and make them be a book, and it just didn't work. So was definitely 100% not a fan of that. So now that all the tea and salt has been spilled, let's get into my top 10 favorite books of the year. Starting with, once again at number 10, which is Persuasion by Jane Austen. It was it was tied with Fahrenheit 451 and also Murder on the Orient Express, but I decided to pick Persuasion just because it just really gripped me. It had all of my favorite tropes in it, and it was just so cleansing and exactly what I needed after one, reading Casino Royale, which was terrible, but also for my foray back into the reading world after I finished Assassin's Fate. And it was just so wonderful, and I loved it. It was so lovely, and as I said, it had my favorite tropes: mutual pining and see things, and smart, sassy women, and I just really, really enjoyed Persuasion. Then coming in at number 9 was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I really enjoyed Frankenstein. I really liked the way that the characters were written. It was phenomenally done. I mean, I am a character-centric reader, so reading this book in particular was really lovely. Just getting to see things and getting a lot of information that was, bastardized over the years about this story was clarified, that I actually really enjoyed. I really liked the setting. It was really well done. The writing was gorgeous. It was just a really, really good book, and I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed it. The next was Good Omens. Good Omens was there when I needed it the most. After I was going through a super rough time, and after finishing Handmaid's Tale, and actually I think I read it side by side with The Handmaid's Tale, it was just so cleansing and so pure and so good, and just so good. And it has now some of my favorite characters in it. Aziraphale and Crowley, in case you didn't know. Love them, adore them, and that's all you need to know. The next was coming in at number 7 is An Irish Country Doctor by Patrick Taylor. And basically, it's a Hallmark movie that takes place in Ireland in a book that takes place during the 1960s. It was just such a lovely slice of life, happy, just generally great book. I loved everything there is to love about that book. Like, it took me 3 days, and I was just so happy reading it. It was just such a good pick-me-up, and exactly what I needed during that point of time in my life and this year. Then coming in at number 6 was Animal Farm by George Orwell. Funnily enough, I adored Animal Farm. Animal Farm was so good, so interesting, so unique, and incredibly relevant to today. It just had illustrations of different, most interesting illustrations of different political systems and different political structures that I have ever seen. It was explained clearly and just in such a great way. It had some really great lines, and I just loved the illustration that he painted throughout the whole book. It's short, but it's very powerful and phenomenally done. And coming in at number 5 was Leonardo da Vinci by Walter Isaacson. And basically it's a biography about Leonardo da Vinci's life. I adore Leonardo da Vinci. I loved Walter Isaacson's portrayal and analysis of Leonardo's life, which he mostly did through Leonardo's journals and his study of the history of the time and the society of the time, as well as studying the paintings and consulting different art historians and examining the paintings himself. He did a phenomenal job painting his life and really just making him jump off the page and feel like he was right there with you. So despite it being a nonfiction, and nonfiction being something that I don't typically gravitate towards, I absolutely loved that biography. Then coming in at number 4 is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. My classics heart was singing the entire time I was reading that book. It is a portrayal of Patroclus and Achilles' relationship in every facet of the word, which is actually heavily implied in the text of the Iliad, which I know a lot of people have not read before reading this. A lot of people see it as a retelling, but I don't want to call it that. I want to say it's more of an expansion on the world and the portrayal that was done by Homer in his Iliad. But I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, because just seeing Patroclus and Achilles' relationship in real live form, written by a classicist, in novelization form was just, it was just everything that I could have wanted, except for, you know, there was one thing that I would have loved to see, and that's just, you know, the angst monster in me. But that's a story for another time. But I just loved it so much. It was one of the most phenomenal books I've read in a long time. Then coming in at number 3 is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson has become a new favorite author of mine. I still haven't read any of his other books except for Elantris, which I really, really, really loved, but he is a phenomenal author, and that was his debut novel. And honestly, just sitting here looking at that work as a debut, his world building was so incredible that I literally lost my mind. His characters were just so incredibly written, and I was invested from the very first page. The plot was really interesting, had my interest, and the writing was spectacular. I mean, his world building and his writing and his characters and his plot, everything about that book was spectacular. I mean, honestly, his world building is just the most phenomenal of all of it, but I definitely thoroughly enjoyed everything about the book, and I can't wait to pick up more of him next year. Now, the last two are Robin Hobb books, because I mean, hi, it's me. So the first one I'm going to talk about is City of Dragons by Robin Hobb, which is the third book in the Rainwild Chronicles. And the reason I'm picking that specific book in my number 2 spot is because of how it really, really starts to tie things together to the other books in all of the other series. It was just so incredibly done. She is a masterful, masterful writer. And the reason, and just City of Dragons was just so much fun because we finally start to understand more of the history and more about specific aspects of the world, and it was just so good. Just so good. Probably my favorite from that specific leg of the series. And last, but certainly not least, my number 1 book of the year was Fool's Quest by Robin Hobb. This should surprise absolutely no one, especially based on my tweets and my Twitter, and then ultimately my review that I did, and just everything. Like, it was absolutely everything. Everything. And I'm not going to say more than that, because there are people here who haven't read the series, who want to, or who are just about getting ready to be in that leg of the journey. And I just feel like I can't talk about it right now, but it's making me emotional thinking about it, because everything that happens in that book was just so good, and it will forever probably be my favorite ROTE book of all of them, which is really just saying something, because so many of them, all of them are phenomenal. But that one, just, it had the perfect pacing, I think, ever. The character growth and the character development and just the character turmoil was spectacular. And the plot of that book, you know, while a lot of people, you know, say Hobbs books are slow, like that's generally how they work, this one just, as I said, had phenomenal pacing. The plot was interesting and just and the writing was some of her best, honestly. A phenomenal writer, and she did such a good job throughout the whole series, but this book honestly was one of her best of everything, and I just will never, ever, ever, ever get over it. Just so incredible, so phenomenal, and I am just dying thinking about it once again, because it was so good. It was so good. My heart forever. My heart forever. That wraps up my recap, my least favorite, my favorite, and just some other general miscellaneous topics I wanted to talk about. I don't have much more to say except for I have a spectacular New Year's Eve, and you know where to find me if you are looking for me. My social media links are down below, or feel free to comment about any of the things that I talked about today. And I will see you in 2019. Bye!